I stood in silence as bulldozers erased the last promise I ever made to my dying wife. 6 hours of demolition justified by a single HOA email. They thought I was powerless. They never checked who I had become. If you believe power should never be abused and justice always finds its way back, subscribe now, because this story proves bullies only win when no one stands up. I arrived before sunrise, the mountain air colder than I remembered, heavy with the smell of diesel and pulverized concrete. The road curved upward the way it always had, but at the final bend, the house was gone. Not damaged. Not partially standing. Gone. In its place lay twisted steel, splintered timber, and shattered glass scattered across the slope like the remains of a collapsed skeleton. For a moment, my mind refused to accept what my eyes were seeing, as if disbelief itself could undo 6 hours of destruction. I stepped out of the truck slowly. Gravel crunched beneath my boots, the same gravel my wife and I had laid by hand years earlier, laughing about how uneven it looked until we learned to make it perfect together. Now it was mixed with fragments of drywall and insulation, white dust clinging to everything like ash after a fire. The infinity pool she had designed, the one she sketched from a hospital bed, was split open. Water spilled uselessly into the ravine below, draining away without purpose, just like everything else that morning. The email replayed in my head with cruel clarity. Sent at 6:47 a.m. demolition authorized due to unpaid HOA fines totaling $38,000. 4 hours notice. No hearing. No warning. Just a declaration. I had read it standing in a Washington hotel bathroom, suit jacket still on, trying not to wake my chief of staff in the next room. By the time I chartered a flight and drove through the mountains in darkness, the damage was already complete. I walked closer, stepping over broken rebar that jutted upward like exposed bone. Each beam snapped in half had once been carefully chosen. My wife, Elaine, had insisted on reclaimed timber, with a carried history in its grain. She believed buildings should remember the past, not erase it. I ran my hand over a splintered piece, recognizing her handwriting still faintly visible where she had marked placement instructions years ago. That was when the weight of it finally hit me. This was not just property damage. This was erasure. Elaine had been an architect until cancer took that future from her piece by piece. When the diagnosis came, she didn't talk about fear. She talked about design. From her hospital bed, she sketched our home, every line deliberate, every window placed to frame the mountains she loved. She made me promise to build it, not as a monument, but as a place where life could continue even after she was gone. I kept that promise with stubborn devotion, pouring years into construction, refusing shortcuts, honoring every detail she envisioned. Ridgemont Estates had seemed like the right place. High elevation. Quiet roads. A gated community that claimed to value privacy and order. For 8 months it was peaceful. Then came the HOA president, a woman who treated authority like inheritance and rules like weapons. At first it was small things. Paint colors. Landscaping choices. Notices that contradicted written approvals. Each time I complied. I paid fines even when I disagreed, because at the time I was still a judge, careful to avoid public conflict, careful to appear above it all. The fines escalated quickly after that. Driveway lighting deemed excessive. Native wildflowers labeled unapproved vegetation. Absurd demands disguised as regulations. Still I paid. Every check was documented. Every receipt saved. It wasn't until she began targeting my housekeeper, questioning her presence, her vehicle, her identity, that the pattern became clear. This was never about compliance. It was about control. By the time the fines reached tens of thousands, I had already paid them all. Twice in some cases, when checks were conveniently misplaced. I had proof for everything. What I didn't have was time. 3 weeks after my inauguration as governor, I was required to attend a conference in Washington. The timing was not accidental. While I was out of state, distracted by duty, the HOA acted with surgical speed. They chose demolition because it was irreversible. Because once something is gone, explanations come too late. They believed the optics would protect them, that no one would dare question an HOA enforcing its rules, even against a governor. They miscalculated the one thing that mattered most. I had spent my entire career understanding systems, laws, and the quiet ways power hides behind procedure. Standing there among the ruins, I felt grief sharpen into resolve. This was not a mistake. It was a decision. And decisions have consequences. Somewhere beneath the rubble, buried deep under what remained of our bedroom, was a fireproof safe Elaine insisted on installing. I knew exactly where it was. I grabbed a shovel from the truck and began digging, hands blistering, breath visible in the cold air. If they thought paperwork was boring, they were about to learn how devastating it could be. I dug until metal met steel, until my fingers found the edge of that safe. The combination still worked. Inside were her original sketches, material lists, and beneath them, every record I needed. Proof. Evidence. The truth preserved exactly as she intended. I stood up slowly, the mountains watching in silence. They thought they had erased my past. What they had done instead was give me a reason to make sure this never happened to anyone else again. The sun climbed higher as I stood among the wreckage, but warmth never reached me. The mountain wind carried dust through the ruins, coating my clothes and skin until I smelled like the demolition itself. I loaded the safe into the truck and drove away, leaving the property exactly as it was. Nothing would be touched until it was documented, catalogued, and preserved. Destruction might erase structures, but it could not erase evidence. I checked into a small hotel an hour down the mountain, the kind of place that smelled faintly of coffee and pine cleaner. From the desk, I made 2 calls. The first was to a civil rights attorney I trusted, someone who understood patterns of abuse disguised as procedure. The second was to a land use attorney who had spent decades dismantling corrupt HOAs one by one. Both answered immediately. Neither sounded surprised. By the time I hung up, a plan had already begun to form. Sleep never came that night. Instead, I spread Elaine's documents across the bed, her handwriting calm and precise even now. Each receipt matched a fine. Each canceled check proved payment. Each email showed approvals later overwritten by the HOA president alone. The pattern was undeniable. She had manufactured violations, collected money, and when that stopped working, escalated to erasure. The timing of the demolition, while I was out of state on official business, crossed from civil dispute into something darker. At dawn, neighbors began calling. Videos had circulated overnight. Footage of bulldozers tearing through glass and timber. The HOA president standing with arms crossed, watching as years of work disappeared. Some called in shock. Others in fear. Many admitted they had paid fines they never understood, just to make the harassment stop. I listened without interrupting, writing names, dates, amounts. Each call added another thread to a growing case. By morning, local news vans arrived at the property. I did not go. I waited. When the HOA president gave her statement, declaring that no one was above the rules, I watched the clip in silence. She believed narrative could outrun documentation. That assumption had protected her for years. It would not protect her now. My attorneys arrived before noon. We walked the site slowly, measuring distances, photographing debris, noting procedural violations. No certified notice. No hearing. No emergency exception that applied. Demolition required due process, even under HOA authority. Especially under HOA authority. Every step they skipped multiplied their liability. By afternoon, the story shifted. What began as an HOA enforcement tale became a due process failure. Then a discrimination inquiry. Then a question of financial misconduct. Reporters started asking about where the fines went. About why only certain homeowners were targeted. About why a demolition was scheduled with 4 hours' notice. Each question narrowed the space the HOA president had to hide. That evening, I returned to the ruins alone. The light was different now, softer, highlighting details I had missed earlier. I found fragments of the atrium glass, still catching the sun the way Elaine intended. I picked one up and slipped it into my pocket, not as evidence, but as reminder. This was personal, but it could not remain only personal. The next day, the civil rights attorney arrived with a camera crew of her own. She documented everything again, explaining quietly that redundancy mattered. Cases like this collapsed when details were missed. She spoke with neighbors, especially those who had been targeted over the years. Stories poured out. Elderly residents fined into panic. Immigrant workers questioned repeatedly. Selective enforcement dressed up as consistency. The land use attorney focused on the HOA's internal structure. He requested financial records as a homeowner's right. The HOA resisted. A court order followed within 48 hours. When the records arrived, the tone changed again. Payments to shell companies. Contracts awarded to relatives. Legal expenses ballooning far beyond any reasonable defense. Money collected for community projects that never materialized. The pieces aligned too cleanly to ignore. This was not mismanagement. It was extraction. Within a week, a class action formed. Homeowners signed affidavits detailing harassment, fines, threats of foreclosure. Some cried while signing. Others apologized for staying silent. Fear had kept them compliant. Visibility broke that fear. The HOA president responded with denial and outrage. She accused me of using my office to intimidate volunteers. She framed herself as a victim of political retaliation. The strategy backfired. The more she spoke, the more contradictions appeared. Emails surfaced. Messages instructing staff to find violations. Notes about making examples of dissenters. Every word fed the case. Then came the environmental report. Materials used in the original build contained regulated substances requiring special handling. The demolition ignored every protocol. Dust had spread across neighboring properties. Families were exposed without warning. That moved the issue beyond civil court. Federal agencies opened inquiries quietly, methodically. Through it all, I said very little publicly. Silence unnerved her more than confrontation. The law moved on its own timeline, indifferent to outrage. Investigations stacked. Depositions scheduled. Subpoenas issued. The story grew larger than my house. The turning point came when a contractor came forward. He had resurfaced the community roads years earlier. The HOA collected a special assessment. He was never paid. The money vanished into an account tied to the president's family. That was no longer negligence. That was theft. Standing again on the mountain one evening, I realized the house had already served its final purpose. It had revealed the truth. Elaine believed architecture should expose how people lived, how power moved through space. In its destruction, her design had done exactly that. The HOA president thought she could erase a problem. Instead, she had excavated one. And the ground beneath her was already giving way. The deposition was scheduled for a Thursday morning, chosen deliberately to minimize attention. The HOA president arrived early, confident in the belief that private conference rooms kept truths contained. She wore the same carefully curated calm she had displayed for years, the look of someone accustomed to controlling rooms through posture alone. That confidence lasted exactly 14 minutes. The civil rights attorney began slowly, establishing routine facts. Name, role, length of service. 9 consecutive years as HOA president. No contested elections. No oversight committee beyond those she appointed herself. Each answer sounded harmless until placed beside the next. Patterns emerged through repetition rather than accusation. When questioned about the demolition, she claimed emergency authority. She cited unpaid fines. She described a process that sounded orderly, fair, and necessary. The land use attorney slid documents across the table without comment. Emails contradicted her timeline. Payment records invalidated her claims. Approval letters exposed overrides she had no power to issue. Her attorney objected frequently, but objections did not erase evidence. The moment her composure fractured came with a single sentence. She was asked why demolition occurred while I was out of state. She paused too long. Silence filled the room. She answered that it was coincidence. Then an email appeared on the screen, sent months earlier, referencing my election and the need to act quickly if I won. The attorney's objection came too late. The answer was already given. Outside that room, momentum accelerated. Homeowners filed additional affidavits. Financial analysts traced funds through shell accounts. The contractor filed his lien publicly, triggering automatic notices across the community. Residents who had once avoided involvement now demanded explanations at emergency meetings. The board fractured under pressure, members resigning to distance themselves from what was unfolding. Media coverage intensified. What began as a local property dispute became a story about unchecked authority. The demolition footage aired nationally. The image of a home erased in hours contrasted sharply with years of meticulous documentation. Viewers responded to that imbalance instinctively. Power without accountability unsettled people. The HOA president attempted damage control. She hired a public relations firm. Statements reframed actions as volunteer service gone wrong. The narrative shifted toward portraying me as an aggressor using influence to crush community governance. It might have worked if facts were flexible. They were not. Then the environmental agency released preliminary findings. Air quality violations. Failure to notify residents. Improper handling of regulated materials. The scope widened again. This was no longer about property law alone. It was about public safety. Federal investigators arrived quietly. No announcements. No press conferences. Just men and women in plain clothes reviewing records, collecting drives, interviewing witnesses. The HOA president stopped speaking publicly after that. Her attorney requested delays. Requests were denied. I returned to the property with engineers and inspectors. They measured foundation damage caused by improper demolition. They cataloged salvageable materials. They documented everything the demolition crew failed to do. Each omission carried a cost. Each shortcut multiplied liability. One afternoon, a retired resident knocked on my hotel door. She carried a folder worn thin from handling. Inside were violation notices dating back 4 years. Threats. Fines. Warnings. Each over trivial issues. Bushes trimmed incorrectly. Lights left on too late. A mailbox painted the wrong shade. She had paid everything quietly, terrified of losing her home. She cried as she apologized for not speaking up sooner. Her folder joined dozens of others. By the end of the month, the class action included more than 24 homeowners. Their stories differed in detail but not in pattern. Selective enforcement. Escalating penalties. Intimidation masked as regulation. The law recognized patterns even when people were trained not to. The HOA president's husband became involved publicly then, attempting to defend her actions through interviews. He framed enforcement as security. He implied threats that never existed. Investigators reviewed his statements alongside purchase records, including tools and materials matching vandalism at the property. Patterns repeated. One evening, after a long day of interviews, I returned to the mountain alone. Snow had begun to settle lightly across the debris. The white softened the edges, making the ruins appear quieter, almost peaceful. I stood where the atrium had once been, looking toward the horizon Elaine loved. For the first time since the demolition, I felt something close to calm. Not because the damage was resolved, but because the truth no longer depended on me alone. Weeks later, subpoenas expanded. Bank accounts were frozen. The HOA's insurance carrier withdrew coverage. Emergency elections were scheduled. Residents packed the clubhouse demanding transparency. When the financial summary was read aloud, disbelief turned into anger. Money collected for roads never paid. Funds diverted to relatives. Legal expenses inflated to suppress dissent. The HOA president did not attend that meeting. She resigned by email 2 hours before it began. Her resignation did not stop the process. It accelerated it. Criminal referrals followed. Charges were prepared. Negotiations began behind closed doors. I was no longer central to the story. The system moved forward without me. Engineers confirmed the house could be rebuilt. The foundation damage was contained. Salvaged materials could be reused. Elaine's sketches guided the process again, though the design would change. Not a monument this time. Something smaller. Something sustainable. Something open. As winter deepened, the property transitioned from crime scene to construction site. Survey stakes replaced caution tape. Snow melted into plans. Volunteers arrived to help clear debris. Neighbors who once avoided the drive now brought food, tools, quiet apologies. The mountain endured. Standing there one evening, Watching the last light fade behind peaks a lane had drawn so many times, I understood something essential. The demolition was meant to end a story. Instead, it exposed one. Power failed when it mistook silence for consent. And accountability, once awakened, did not go back to sleep. The arrests came quietly, without spectacle, the way real consequences usually do. There were no flashing lights on the mountain road, no sirens echoing through the trees. Federal agents arrived before dawn at the former HOA president's home, carrying folders instead of megaphones. By the time the sun rose over Ridgemont Estates, the narrative she had spent years controlling was gone, replaced by affidavits, charges, and sealed warrants. News spread faster than any official statement. Homeowners woke to messages from neighbors, links to court filings, and photographs of boxes being carried out of a house once associated with authority. The same people who had feared her clipboard now read indictments bearing her name. Wire fraud, embezzlement, civil rights violations, environmental crimes tied to the demolition. The list felt unreal until it wasn't. I did not attend the first hearing. I didn't need to. My role had ended the moment the system finally engaged on its own terms. Years on the bench had taught me that justice worked best when it was boring, procedural, and indifferent to status. This case had reached that stage. Evidence spoke. People listened. The HOA collapsed quickly after that. Emergency elections replaced the old board. Financial records were posted publicly for the first time. Residents learned exactly how much money had moved through shell accounts, how many fines had been used to fund personal ventures, how many threats had been issued simply to maintain silence. Anger replaced fear. Participation replaced avoidance. Settlements followed. The HOA's insurer paid rather than risk trial. Homeowners received refunds for years of illegal fines. Contractors were finally paid. Liens were lifted. The community amenities, once on the brink of foreclosure, were secured under transparent management. The damage extended far beyond my property, and so did the recovery. My portion of the settlement covered the rebuild. I set aside funds for a scholarship in Elaine's name, something she would have loved. Architecture students from backgrounds like hers, people who saw design as service rather than status, applied within weeks. Her influence extended further in death than it ever had in life, and that felt right. Rebuilding began in early spring. I hired a young architect whose enthusiasm reminded me of Elaine before illness dulled her energy. We spread the salvaged timbers across sawhorses, brushing off dust, reading old notes still etched into the grain. The new design was smaller, grounded, integrated with the land instead of towering over it. Less statement, more shelter. Neighbors volunteered to help clear debris. Some worked in silence. Others apologized openly. Both were welcome. Community repaired itself slowly, like soil recovering after a burn. Trust grew back in increments, fragile but real. The criminal case moved forward methodically. Plea negotiations replaced bravado. Testimony from homeowners painted a consistent picture of intimidation and selective enforcement. Financial experts explained how money vanished. Environmental specialists described exposure risks ignored for convenience. Each witness added weight. When the former HOA president entered a plea, there were no speeches. No apologies. Just a record entered and a future altered permanently. Her husband faced separate charges tied to intimidation and vandalism. Their authority, once absolute within those gates, dissolved completely in the presence of federal sentencing guidelines. Ridgemont Estates changed its bylaws within months. Fines capped. Hearings required. Independent audits mandated annually. Any foreclosure or demolition required overwhelming approval and external review. The rules now protected residents instead of preying on them. The state legislature took notice. Hearings were scheduled. I testified not as governor, but as a homeowner. I described the process, not the pain. The gaps in oversight. The ease with which small powers could metastasize when left unchecked. Lawmakers listened because the evidence was clear and the pattern familiar. Reforms passed that year. Written notice requirements extended. Mediation mandated. Self-dealing criminalized explicitly. Homeowners gained access to records by default instead of by fight. Other states followed. The issue was no longer niche. It was recognized as systemic. The rebuilt house finished in late autumn. No ceremony. No ribbon. Just a quiet evening with the mountains visible through clean glass. The wind moved through the structure the way Elaine once described, a low hum that felt like breathing. The salvaged beams held. The foundation rested steady. I placed one of her original sketches on the wall near the entrance, not framed, just pinned, like she would have done during planning. It reminded me why the house existed at all. Not for display. For living. The hiking path opened the following spring. Families walked it on weekends. Children pointed out birds. Couples stopped at the overlook. The land gave something back now, instead of being fought over. Elaine had wanted that. Occasionally, letters arrived from people across the country. Homeowners dealing with similar abuse. People asking where to start. I sent them the same resource guide we published online. Request records. Document everything. Speak together. Systems depended on isolation. They failed under light. One evening, I sat on the deck watching the sun drop behind the peaks. The rebuilt home felt different from the original, but better in ways I hadn't expected. It carried loss without being defined by it. It stood because many people refused to accept silence as the price of peace. Justice didn't restore what was destroyed. It transformed what remained. That was enough. And in the quiet after everything ended, I finally felt at home again.